Our society is a society of abusers and victims of abuse. Our society is an abusive society. You know how I can tell? Because we cannot distinguish between the two types of responsibility. The responsibility of the perpetrator versus the responsibility of the victim. The reason why we can't tell the difference, or the indication that we cannot or refuse to, is the fact that we only have one word for these two types of responsibilities. Look how much trouble I had to go through to make a distinction between the two. Well, there is a difference, and I'd like to describe the consequences of us mixing it all up into just one term. The consequence is very convenient for the perpetrator because the victim is convinced that they are the ones responsible for carrying the guilt for having done the abuse to themselves. This is a ploy employed by the perpetrator in order to take the onus of responsibility for the guilt off of their own shoulders and pass it instead to the victim by convincing the victim that they are the ones responsible for the abuse that has occurred to them. So the perpetrator gets away with murder, so to speak, or maybe all the way. Meanwhile, the victim is too caught up in assuming the guilt that they don't bother to assume what they are supposed to assume. Not the guilt. It's pretty obvious they didn't do it to themselves, but this is an emotional programming that overrides intellectual judgment. And consequently, the victim is incapable of forming the correct opinion because he's too busy forming the erroneous opinion that the victim is the one guilty of performing this abuse. Emotionally, the emotions override the intellect. They're just too powerful. Now, what they are supposed to be thinking about is the other responsibility of that only the victims are responsible for assuming, and that is the responsibility for changing the situation, healing the curse or the pain or the illness of abuse, of having been abused, the consequences, healing from the consequences of the abuse. And also, in order to do that, they have to also correct in their mind the illusion, the error, the fallacy of logic that they are the ones guilty of perpetrating the abuse, and instead correctly assign it to the perpetrators themselves. Now, whether or not they're required to go and forgive the perpetrators is a separate matter. I think that's a consequence of healing. And it's not something you set out to do because it's impossible once you figure out that that you as the victim are not the ones responsible for what has happened to you. It's pretty hard to forgive the perpetrator at that point. It's very easy to be angry at them. But it's not really the approach to take for the purposes of healing. The approach to take is simply to give yourself what the perpetrator has failed to give you. They have given you the opposite of what they should have given you. They gave you this abuse instead. And you have to give it to yourself sufficient enough to heal from all of the painful consequences of that abuse. Now, unfortunately, that's not the case, because instead the victim feels guilty for having done this to themselves. They never bother to, or they cannot, blame the perpetrator, and so they go back to the perpetrator expecting acceptance, at the very least, but acceptance without change. This is a problem that the victim doesn't want to change. They don't want to heal because they're too busy feeling guilty. They just want to be accepted for the guilt. Why? Because they want the perpetrator to accept the guilt. Well, the perpetrator is not about to. They would not have abused the victim in the first place had they taken responsibility for the guilt of having done so. They never would have abused the victim. And they certainly don't have the answers for healing the victim, should the victim take the correct responsibility upon their shoulders. So they can't do either. They can't heal the victim, and they can't take responsibility they can't take the guilt for having done this in the first place. So they can't do either, or else they never would have initiated this whole process. So they are the last persons to go to for acceptance and love. And loving them on the expectation of getting that love back. I should know, I made that mistake myself, returning home after a failure from college. I expected love from the family. I never got it. Eventually the family broke up, only after stigmatizing me with a mental illness. And this, again, is an indication, a diagnostic check that we can use to determine that the perpetrator is shifting the onus of guilt onto the victim's shoulders. It's another example of that procedure, which is very convenient on the part of the perpetrator, but helps the victim not at all. In other words, it just confuses the victim and makes it that much more difficult for the victim to sort all this mess out. So, what happens due to the fact that the victim is ignorant of what has happened and ignorant of what to do about it, the correct procedure, they go and they spread it around to everyone else. And in some cases freak out the other people, and that's what's happened to me. I literally have freaked out. It took me 24 hours to get over it, because I forgot how miserable my alcoholic buddy is. That he literally wants to be accepted as he is and not change anything. See, I used to think of this in terms of PTSD, in terms of Leon Ernest Demon, how he views the situation, how the a PTSD victim, well, in the case of my ex, she just wanted to be accepted for what I didn't really understand the mechanics. Why that is. Why do victims of abuse not want to change? Why are they so terrified of change? I simply knew that they are. I didn't know what was wrong with that. What spawned that erroneous line of reasoning. Well, first of all, it's emotional. It's not logical. It's not mental. So that's why it's so easy for it to be fallacious in its logical reasoning. But more importantly, the mechanics involved. So I didn't know that. I just knew that they were too scared to change. And so they never do. They just want to be accepted the way they are. And boy, who wants to accept them the way they are? Because they're too busy spreading it around. Or in the case of my ex, she tried to keep it to herself, actually. She stayed away from people by not talking to anyone, and so people thought she was a dummy because she never spoke a word in public gatherings. Her mom just dragged her around to these vegan potlucks, and she never spoke with anyone. So she opened up to me only because I became her lover, and she trusted me and opened up. And I could see she's a very intelligent person. She just doesn't speak to most people because she doesn't want them to know what shape she's in. Now, an alcoholic does the same thing, but in a different manner. But still, it's the same thing. They hide themselves from people by being drunk. That way, you don't have to know that something weird is going on. They're too ashamed of themselves to expose themselves, just like my ex. But instead of staying away from people, the drunk does the opposite, because now they feel fully capable of handling being among people, so they take their drunkenness out in public in front of your face. And they're so friendly. They want to become your friend. Anywho, so that's my analysis of the situation. We don't have two words. Well, I just used them. I found them. Guilt is the responsibility of the perpetrator, which they refuse to take. And healing is the responsibility of the victim, not of the perpetrator, or else the perpetrator would never have perpetrated the abuse in the first place, had they known that they were being abusive. So they're the last people to provide for healing. But it's the victim's responsibility to heal. And so healing is the word for the victim's responsibility to take upon their shoulders and give up the guilt and forget about the guilt. They have no business taking on the onus of responsibility for being guilty. That's the last thing they should be responsible for. But healing, yes, they are responsible, because no one can heal them but themselves. I mean, people can help, but only when the victim wants that type of help. Not acceptance, but healing, which involves change, which means it's going to be painful. It's never pleasant to change when you're the victim, to change yourself out of it. But the results are always the same: bliss. I don't think it's joy, because joy just means you become the alcoholic, the one who's in denial. Then you become happy, and you spread around your massive guilt into everybody else's lives, and they don't want it. They don't need it, they don't want it, and they just want you to go away. Because you're a nuisance to them, basically. No, the only job of the victim is to heal, and that's the only one that works. It's the only one that solves the problem at the source, which is the victim now, because the perpetrator has transferred the abuse to the victim so that they don't have to deal with the guilt anymore. So now the victim has to deal with it. But in order for this to stop, the victim has to heal in order to heal from the guilt, let alone everything else that happened that caused the consequences of the abuse, the pain and whatnot. Anyway, so healing and guilt and healing, these are the two words to distinguish between the two types of responsibilities. And so when somebody says take responsibility, they're actually being so completely vague as to be useless. It's a useless phrase, and one that should anger someone when they hear it, even though they may not know why. They're angry when they hear it, because they know the user of that word is lying, because they're trying to confuse the issue by using that word. So not only does it indicate a lack of awareness on the part of our society that we don't use something else other than that word. Well, no, that's it. That's all it is. So we continue to use that word to spawn further confusion, as if it's acceptable, which it is not, yet we do it anyway. Yeah, so it's a word we need to get away from using, because it's the wrong word. It only perpetrates the problem, or repeats it, keeps it going. No, it's guilt versus healing. Those are the only two words to use. I take full guilt for what I've done rather than responsibility. I take full healing upon myself rather than guilt. And that's what I've been doing yesterday, and I've made a little progress, but it's hard. I'm still not meditating twice a day, so I know I haven't resolved the pain, the burden of pain. It's hard. But I keep trying sporadically, and then I keep giving up. I don't know why. And really what it amounts to is coming up with a protocol and then engaging in my case, the monetary expense to commit to that protocol. I've already committed to other protocols that I know my body needs to do, needs to have provided for it in order to cope with a congenital defect of being born to an alcoholic pregnant mom who was fasting on a raw food diet of fruits and vegetables and nuts and seeds and avocados and tons of spoiled grape juice, mixed 50-50 blend with spoiled carrot juice when I was a pre-infant, a fetus, growing up inside of her womb. She was that way for 10 years before I was conceived, so it's hard, it's impossible, or seemingly, for me to grow out of it, but healing is the first step, though, and it's been episodic at best. It has not been continuous for me, because there are so many different protocols I have to pursue, and each one is specific for its own domain. I need potassium iodide for my liver, for my failed metabolic rate of my liver function, so I don't process ammonia, and so I become drunk without even trying. And then there are other things I have to do. I have to take silver to boost, to take the burden of of healing off of, and remove the guilt off of my white blood cells, because they're not doing their job that they're supposed to do. So there are all these things I have to do, and I have to take, keep cayenne on hand in case my left arm starts getting numb. I have to keep ginger on hand in case I get a cold condition in my head. And now cardamom is a new herb I'm using to cool down my ardorous heat of belligerence. I hate the world and want to blame the world for what has befallen me. So I'm beyond blaming my parents. I just want to hate the world for doing this to me, right? I want to blame everyone and stealing my son from me, rather than blaming my brother and my neighbors of Studio City. So the cardamom is to keep the ardor of belligerence down, cool it down. And it works very well. And other things, occasionally eat fish when I have to, which is on occasion, because that's a healing, medicinal food of its own for people who want to be healed of abuse. Definitely. But you ever watching a victim of abuse asking for fish? No, they're always asking for something else. They're either a vegan or they're a meat lover or anything other than fish. Doesn't work. You're not going to get the process of healing going without it. Although it doesn't end with that, unfortunately. It's not enough, unfortunately. And then there are things I have to avoid because I've gotten so sensitive from a failed body, let alone a failed mind, and mixed up feelings, that now I have to avoid wheat, which I'm allergic to, and avoid gluten, which I cannot digest. So I got a problem there. I have to avoid raw food because I ended up abusing myself with antifreeze poisoning to the point that now I'm worse off than I was at birth. So to stay alive, I have to also take cesium chloride to fight cancers that come up, and keep iodine tincture on hand in case I should get a skin growth to burn it off. So it's all kinds of things I have to either do or keep on hand in case I need it. Now, I used to use olive leaf, but it's been superseded by my use of silver, so I don't need olive anymore, and that's a good thing. But olive leaf is good for things like hepatitis B, which I gave myself by allowing myself to become friendly with somebody whom I knew I shouldn't should not have done. So I didn't like him. And why should I allow him? Because I'm born weak. I don't have much backbone. And to defend myself, or anyone else in my family. So I don't have a son for that reason. I'm just a weekapoo, and it's hard for me to defend myself and protect myself, but I do have to do it, and being a loner is a kind of cop-out because it's the easy way to do it, which doesn't really solve anything, but at my age, I am taking shortcuts more often than not. So I stay in my little cave and I don't go out. Why bother dealing with the din of humanity? I might meet the wrong people and become friends with them, and then regret my inability to help them. I can barely handle helping myself, let alone trying to help somebody else heal from abuse. Anywho, so I'm definitely not schizophrenic, but, why would somebody be schizophrenic in the first place? It's because they're afraid of being abused all over again. That's all it is. It's the only thing they're terrified of. If it's misplaced fear, that's something else. Then yes, it becomes paranoia. But it has its cause, its root cause. Its root cause is being the victim of abuse, and so it's not the onus of guilt does not rest on the shoulders of the victim. The one who is labeled or stigmatized with the label of schizophrenia. It's on somebody else's shoulders. Only the healing is on my shoulders, the responsibility for healing. So there are two versions of responsibility. Maybe that's the best way to put it. And they're so completely opposite from each other that it's tragically ironic that we get them mixed up. I think that's the point of this recording. It's a tragic irony that we get them mixed up because they are so opposite to each other, so completely opposite. Each one excludes the other from itself. In other words, it's not the job of the victim to be guilty because it's so opposite to the healing process. It prevents healing, completely prevents it. Meanwhile, the person who's supposed to be guilty, they've managed to abuse somebody else as their procedure for healing, rather than actually healing themselves. They simply sit back and say, well, at least it wasn't me. It was somebody else now who's been abused instead of me. That's their line of reasoning, why they did the abuse in the first place and spread it around. By failing to heal themselves, they went ahead and automatically abused somebody else. Simply because they failed to heal themselves, automatically they will abuse somebody else and feel relieved by having done so. And so this was necessary for me to see the healing protocol, how I'm supposed to implement it. It's supposed to involve no one else but me. If I take it out in public and try to perform it, it doesn't work. But when I do it in private, it works because I involve no one but myself, because I'm the only one who I am responsible for healing. I am not responsible for healing anyone else. As Charlie put it, healing anybody else is extra credit. It's nice if you can do it, but it's not required. It's an option that you leave this world in better shape than you find it. But the only requirement is to heal oneself. And ultimately, it can be said that we are all victims of abuse, whether or not we know it. We just may not know it. Yet some people are lucky and fortunate because they lead lives that never involve having been abused, and they're the fortunate ones. They're lucky because they don't have the karma, or else it's not for them to go through it in this lifetime, but whatever. Maybe they're riding high on some good karma that's going to last a certain length and then peter out, and then they're or not peter out because maybe they keep doing the right things so that they never have to fall into that trap in the first place. You know, there are a lot of different types of sin. Abuse is not the only one. But abuse is a pretty hideous one, and it's fairly common. I'm amazed how many families. This is a family-oriented apartment complex I live in, and I am amazed how many families abuse their children by physically beating them. I'm truly amazed. And as far as I know, the abuse of violence is more common than the abuse of sex. And this I don't understand. To this day, I still don't understand why violence is more common. Violent abuse is more common than sexual abuse, because what did John Lennon say? Make love, not war. Or what did the peacemongers say in the 60s in response to the Vietnam War? Make love, not war. So I don't understand it. I don't understand the prevalence of violence over sex. I don't understand it. Regardless of the fact that they're both abusive, I don't understand them. But repeating it doesn't make it any clearer to me. So that's an enigma, a mystery that I have yet to resolve. In the meantime, I can pursue my protocol by spending the money to make it private, to make the healing process private, and be willing to spend the money to do whatever it takes to make sure I keep up with the protocol, because I have to do it either on a daily basis or worse, more often than that, more often than once a day, because I have to heal. And the protocol that I'm engaging in is very short-lived when it's so overdue. You know, it's been a long time since the last time I've tried doing it. And this time I'm going at it with a little more gusto, and because I don't know, for whatever reason, things are clearer, you know? So I realize I have to privatize the process. I make sure I keep it private. And no longer take it out in public and show off the fact that I'm a victim of abuse, because nobody understands it when you take it out in public. They think there's something wrong with you. You're cuckoo or something, or you're mentally ill or something, when in fact all you are is a victim of abuse in a state of confusion as to the necessity for healing, how important it is to do whatever it takes to heal, and to do it now, right away. Don't wait. Don't wait an instant. But the protocol I've chosen, or it chose me by way of inspiration back in the 80s, and I very rarely have implemented it, is very useful. Very rarely have I ever done it in private. In fact, very extremely, sometimes not at all. Usually I did it in public, but after a decade or more, I eventually started to try to do it in private, but it was very episodic at best. Anywho, it is possible in our technologically savvy culture to take responsibility for healing myself by doing it in private. It just costs a little bit of money, not a lot of money. It's not buying organic vegan food or just healthy food in general is more pricey than the expense of this particular healing protocol that I'm starting to trying to reinitiate all over again, but in a private manner for a change. It's not at all expensive, as I'm finding out. It's actually quite inexpensive, but it does require some commitment on my part, and so money is part of it, but it's not all of it. But it is privatizing it is the big part. Keeping the healing to myself. I'm not trying to heal the world by showing off how disgusted I am, or belligerent I am, or mixed up and confused I am, and none of that. I'm just trying to heal myself. And the protocol works. It does work in its own limited way, and that's why it has to be kept up on a daily basis, because at best it's temporary, but it does the job, and it does give me the experience of bliss, which lets me know that it's doing the job. You know, it's not joy, it's bliss, which is peace, right? Peace is the side effect of bliss. One of the side effects is being at peace with yourself. That you've gone through shit, but for a little few moments, you're relieved of that fact. And you get to experience the benefit of that relief, which is very peaceful. A lot of peace. So peace is not a technique, even though it's one of the few words in our English language we have not abused, such that it still means what it originally was intended to mean, and it has not become altered over time. Hallelujah is another word that we have not abused, and amen is another one we have not abused. We have begun to abuse amen because we start to mispronounce it and call it omen. Oh, what's the omen, you know? But amen is the correct pronunciation and conveys the correct meaning. Anywho, meanwhile, we can mispronounce the other two words and get away with it, and so it's not an issue. But it shows we're already starting to abuse that word, amen. Amen. Well, abuse of language is the first thing I studied when I was a 4-year-old. So I've been a student of abuse, oddly enough. But now it has to get into the physiology of how to treat my physiology so that my mind can be relieved and healed, at least from the standpoint of not having to carry around the consequences of abuse in my body anymore, at least for a few moments. To give me relief for a few moments so that my mind can be relieved for a few moments. That's healing. You know, it amounts to some, a limited amount. It's better than not doing it at all, let me tell you, because I can be pretty freaked out when I don't bother to follow any protocol at all, no matter how poorly constructed it may be, you know, like taking it out in public. And I guess that's why I liked the idea of meditation when I was a teenager, when I first learned about it, because you do it in private, you know? You don't take it out in public. It's just too bad I've lost my innocence over that, so that I can't do it anymore and get the results that I used to get. But I'll know I'm successful when I can regain that much innocence again to restart the process of meditation twice a day. Because that's a very effective protocol. When it's done correctly, when it's done innocently, it works like a charm. It works like magic. But I have to pursue these others that are very piecemeal and ineffective and quirky and expensive and time-consuming, because it's all I've got to work with. I'm out of shape so completely that I have to make little progress before I can make bigger progress. And so these are small steps of progress. And I guess what more could be said about victims of abuse in general is that they have to start from square one, which is baby steps. They can't tackle the big steps until they get to them, after first tackling the smaller ones of how to go about the healing process. And that's probably why it takes so long in some cases, because of the multiple types of steps involved and the time to engage in each one before moving on to the next step,